Well, welcome everyone. I'm Julie Levin-Caro. I am a professor of art history at Warren Wilson College and chair of the art department. And I am so pleased to welcome all of you and to be here with you. We have students, faculty, and staff from Warren Wilson College here, and also members of our community near and far on this event for our exhibition, Martha Klippinger, Vibrating Boundaries. And I'm going to take a few minutes just to introduce Martha. But first, I just want to do a little housekeeping, which is I'm going to do an introduction. Martha's going to give her talk. And then if you have some questions while she's talking or after, you can put them in the chat. And then we'll look at the chat and do the questions at the end. Okay, so we are just delighted to have Martha with us tonight, and we are thrilled to have her work in our Elizabeth Holden Gallery. It is on view through February 17th. And just in case you haven't gotten to see it yet or making some plans, our gallery hours are Monday through Friday from 10 to 4 and Saturdays from 1 to 4, or you can also contact us to make an appointment. Okay, so Martha is going to talk with us tonight about her career and provide us with some context for the quilts, wood constructions, prints, ceramic pieces, and woolen tapetes or woven rugs that are on view in the gallery. And as you will hear and see, Martha works playfully and improvisationally with color across a wide variety of media. And her experimentation with materials and color relationships is in conversation with Joseph and Ani Albers, former Bauhaus artists who immigrated to the US and who taught close by to us here in the Shenandoah Valley at Black Mountain College. And like Martha, the Albers were also inspired by the art and architecture and traditions of Mexico, which you will hear more about how her work intersects with that. And we're so pleased to be able to show some silkscreen plates from our first edition portfolio of Albers's interaction of color alongside Martha's recent works. Martha was born and raised in Columbus, Georgia. Her bachelor's in art is from Fordham University, and she received her MFA from Mason Gross School of Art at Rutgers University. Martha is the recipient of numerous grants and awards, including the 2017 Ella Fountain Pratt Emerging Artist Grant from the Durham Arts Council, and an American Academy of Arts and Letters Purchase Award. In 2013, she won a Fulbright Garcia Robles Research Grant, which she completed in Oaxaca, Mexico. Recently, Martha was a fellow at the Kohler Arts and Industry, where she made some of the ceramic pieces that are she made a number of ceramic pieces, some of which are in our show. She's also had fellowships with the Sam and Adele Golden Art Foundation, Art Space, McDowell Colony, Edward F. Albee Foundation, and the Marie Walsh Sharp Art Foundation. Her work is in the collections of the Nerman Museum of Contemporary Art, Duke University, and the Columbus Museum, and it has been featured in numerous publications, including the Brooklyn Rail, Burnaway, and Hyperallergic. It is my pleasure to turn this over now to Martha. And so remember, if you came in after I said this, if you have some questions for Martha, please put them in the chat and we will try to get to them all at the end.
Great. Thanks, Julie, for that thorough introduction and for saving some of the work for me. I have really been delighted to have this opportunity at Warren Wilson for a number of reasons, and I'll try to address all of those now. But I realize some of you aren't going to be able to see this exhibition, so I wanted to start with some images of the gallery. So this first one is just kind of a preview to give you a quick overview of the variety of work that I make, both with different materials and processes. And I'll go through and talk more specifically about each work as we go on. But the invitation came from Julie, and I was really excited because it's a fairly large gallery and it's a funky shape. It's like this sort of weird kind of almost trapezoid, and it has these two movable walls in the space, but you can't take the walls out of this space. And so I knew that I was going to need to make a model of the gallery. And I really like to think about space and how my work is displayed. So it was fitting that the timing of this show was during this time of being sort of in lockdown and a period of reflection back on my work. So having an ample amount of space has given me an opportunity to kind of bring works from different time periods and put them together and think about how the architecture can kind of create sight lines and ways of seeing different progressions over time. But also there was the excitement about the fact that Warren Wilson has one of the first editions of Joseph Albers' Interaction of Color. And so I have this this slide here. On the left is a screenshot that I took of the Beckler Museum's Instagram page, because I just discovered this last month that they have installed the complete set of Albers' Interaction of Color. So for those of you at Warren Wilson, if you want to drive to Charlotte, there's this great opportunity to see it all spelled out in front of you. And the title for the show is Vibrating Boundaries, which is one of the sections of the Interaction of Color book. And I also wanted to bring that title in both to sort of make you aware of potential vibrating boundaries, which is where you might have contrasting colors that are similar in value. And so the border between the colors kind of buzzes and maybe cast a shadow on one color. But also vibrating boundaries to sort of suggest the interdisciplinary nature of my work and the fact that I'm not a painter or a sculptor, but I'm kind of working in textiles and doing this and that and mixing media. So hopefully that comes through. But I wanted to just give you this picture on the right of some of the rugs I put up in the gallery and the old big box of Interaction of Color and its loved age that you can see. So here's the title wall. Just kind of scan through the gallery for those of you who can't make the visit. On the left, you see a large quilt. And then on the right, this red rectangle with the blue border is actually a ceramic work. It's cast, it's a slip cast porcelain piece. And then on the top is a painted wood construction. So it's kind of a low relief of wood. And then on the bottom is a gouache painting on paper. So again, talking about architecture and thinking about ways to present work so that you can see a sort of breadth of work in one view. So those are those three works on the left. And then on the distance, there's another construction and a series of recent tapetes that I'll talk more about that process. But it's, it's exciting for me to have this opportunity to really play and show off the shifts in scale, whether it's going from like a collage, from a large scale bed quilt to, a relief that's like the size of a book. And so I'm interested in sort of how our bodies are interacting with works and how paintings maybe become more like objects and can interact with the wall. Again, I'll just kind of move through. So when you see these pictures, the works that are in the vitrines are plates from the Interaction of Color. And this is actually a digital version of the Interaction of Color from an app that I have that Yale University Press put out a few years back. But this is an example of one of the plates, and it's basically sort of making you aware of the fact that colors a color has many faces, I think is the title of this section. And so if you look at did not mean to go that way. If you look at the sort of brown square on the top, when it's surrounded by blue, it's much lighter and kind of reads more like an ochre. Whereas when you see it down in the orange, it's surrounded by a lighter color, so it appears darker and it appears maybe more green than orange. And so this kind of shows you, but it's actually the same color. So these exercises that he developed were really to kind of train your eye. It wasn't about creating like a doctrine of color or a theory that had to be sort of mandated, but it was about this kind of collective engagement of looking and considering color and how much it changes and evolves depending on its surrounding and how it's used. So this is another example, and this is where he was illustrating that two colors can appear the same. So like if your eye sort of focuses on the horizon line there, the two smaller rectangles appear to be more or less the same color. Oh, sorry, my mouse is funny. But if if you look, they're actually two different colors. So one's kind of this taupe and one's a teal, but depending on how you surround them, they sort of change and become more like one another. So I think that's just, those are ideas that engaged me and really carry me through my process, because I work intuitively, and it's very much about looking at what's in front of me and responding to it. And I like to think that some of the work that I make is kind of providing opportunities to think about some of the ideas that Albert's put out there. So to go back, sorry. So this is the last wall that I'm showing in the gallery. And then I wanted to show just a couple of installation shots from previous exhibitions, just to, again, sort of reiterate the nature of my work and the fact that I'm working across a variety of media and really playing with color and geometry and trying to create this rhythm with color. So in this instance, there's the frame lithograph that's also in the exhibition, and then there's constructions on the wall and a tapestry. If you look on the floor to the bottom right, that's a sculpture that really, physically engages with the architecture in a more specific way. And I've installed that both in this instance where it's sort of emerging out of a corner, but then I've also exhibited it entering into a corner. So I like open-ended things and playing with space. And this is an earlier exhibition. This is from 2014. And this was when I was really making lots of wooden works and making paintings out of found materials. And this work in the far end is a circle. It's actually a peach basket that has layers of planes of color in it. And then in the center is a mirror. So you actually sort of see yourself surrounded by color. So there's a, playful nature to both the individual works, but then how ultimately they're installed. There's a few of the constructions in this exhibition. And I present these together just to kind of put out both my interest in patterns and kind of breaking patterns. So with my work, I like for there to be a certain simplicity and kind of quick read, but then the color maybe shows subtle changes as you look at it longer, or there might be a shape that's distorted, or, things that are shifting in direction, but also just there's a lot of tactility there. And so for the work on the left, it's mostly wood, but with paint on it, but then some of the shapes are actually cut fabric. And with the work on the right, it's squares of wood on top of a hexagon of wood that's then layered with fabric that's then painted. And then the individual squares actually have paint skins collaged on them. So, this idea of sort of taking paint and making it into this pliable material that can be cut and collaged. So kind of an ambiguity of materials at times. And then now I'm just jumping completely back in time to, this is not me as a baby. This is actually my daughter, but she is on a quilt that my great grandmother made. And so I realized when I was in undergrad, and I brought some of these images in thinking about talking to students tonight. But when I was in undergrad and started making paintings, I was remembering the relationship that I had to my great grandmother's quilts. And I can recall like laying in bed and looking at this sort of 9-patch quilt design that I don't have a photograph of, I'm sorry, but and thinking about like, why would you put those colors together? And like, if I fold the quilt, I can see what these two colors would have looked like together. And just this sort of manipulating this quilt in ways to see other color combinations. And it's very much a la Albert, to be looking at what's in front of me and studying these color effects. And so I think that staying in bed and looking at quilts has really inspired a lot of my making. But also, as Julie mentioned, I grew up in Columbus, Georgia, and it's a textile town. And like I said, my great grandmother was a quilter. My father was a shirt salesman. And so the first quilt I made was when I was 17. And a wonderful quilter who you can follow on Instagram, Kathy Fussell, taught me how to quilt. And I made a quilt out of my father's shirt swatches for the Arrow shirts that he was selling. And it was a very tedious process because I was trying to cut them all perfectly to to fit together. And then I really hated hand quilting, and like, it just wasn't a very satisfying process when I look back at it. I was glad to do it, but it didn't really inspire me to make another quilt. And then a number of years later, when I was living in New York and was a student at Fordham University, I took a modern art class, and on the left side of the screen was the book that I was using. And on the cover was this quilt that Sonia Delaney had made for her son, Charles. And I just spent a lot of time looking at that, probably because it was during a time when we were still using slide carousels and there was time to sit and look at a book in your classroom while you waited for the projector to warm up. But that quilt, I just felt like I could stare at this book cover forever. And I've come to know Sonia Delaney's work more over the years, and I think there are a lot of elements that have continued to sort of seep in and inspire my work. And there's just this bold use of color and pattern, and this application and sort of all surfaces, and this merging of art and life. And so the fact that here in 1925, she's zipped up her Citroen with this pattern, or she's made a tapestry coat for Gloria Swanson, and everything just kind of merged together. And there were also these sort of shared interest in effects of color that have continued to inspire me. So that sort of had me thinking a little bit differently about quilts. And right about the same time was when the Gee's Bend quilts were on display at the Whitney in New York. And so it was just incredible, like, serendipity that I was there at that time, got to see this show, and it just had this sort of, I don't know, it's like I kind of get speechless, like, trying to talk about it sometimes, because I feel like it was such a powerful experience seeing these works and then just thinking back on how they've continue to inspire me. I think it's really interesting that Julie has invited me to show at the Holden Gallery, because was it 2014 when you had the exhibition of the prints from?
Yes.
Yes. So Julie helped curate an exhibition where the Gee's Bend quilters worked with a master printer to produce prints. And so, I'll talk more about my interest in how I've worked across media and how things have translated from one medium to another. But it's been exciting to have this relationship with Julie and think about these quilts that were then translated into prints. And when I say translated into prints, the quilters actually patched fabric together to then be made into prints. So it wasn't like a digital print, like, here's a quilt that's already made and let's make a print of it. It was, they were part of the process. But I think it just goes to show the strength in their design sensibility, and that they could apply it across a variety of media. So this is just kind of going back to when I was an undergrad making paintings. And I think I had this interest too in both sort of modestly sized paintings and then large scale. So these larger paintings were about 6-7 feet tall, and then this other painting was like 10 inches tall. And these, were paintings I was making in my dorm room. It's like I pushed all my furniture to one side of the room and then tacked up canvas and didn't stretch it. It was just unstretched canvas that I would paint on. So then fast forward to 2019, this is an exhibition I had where I displayed 3 fairly recent quilts that I made. And the 2 on the left are really more like memorial quilts. So I think I started to think even more about the material that went in and the sort of history behind the materials. And so the quilts on the far left was my late brother's shirts and bed sheets. And then the one in the middle was my mother-in-law's skirt that she had had, and some fabric that I had worn at the same age that she had been wearing that skirt. So just thinking about the sort of histories that these objects can imbue has been into my work more and more. Oops, sorry. So this quilt is at the front of the gallery, and it's one that incorporates terry cloth from like a beach towel. And so again, I've been using reclaimed materials, but really studying their textures and their colors. And so in this instance, like the terry cloth, if you think about a towel, the top of it might be slightly different in color from the other ones. So that center band of the green and pink, I mean, not green and pink, green and white is slightly lighter in value than the others. And it's because of sort of that play of flipping it. So trying to really kind of create some rhythm and movement with the color. And then in 2019, I was invited to be in an exhibition that was about Pasaquan, which is this visionary artist environment in Buena Vista, Georgia, not Buena Vista, but it's near where I grew up in Georgia, and it's about 40 miles away from Columbus. And so I had an experience of visiting this place when I was young, like 8 years old or so. And I think I was just totally overwhelmed by the color and pattern, and it has had this lasting impact on me. It fell into disrepair, and then it was recently renovated and sort of refurbished by some assistance from the Kohler Foundation. But its maker was this Eddie Owens Martin, and he was the son of sharecroppers in Georgia and had fled home, moved to New York, and just totally soaked up the culture in New York, and would go to like the Met Museum and the Natural History Museum and just absorb all these cultures from around the world. And then he had this vision that he should create this land of Pasaquan. And so here are two views. There's an interior view where there are all these mandalas, and then an exterior view, but he sculpted it all with cement, and it's just basically like house paint. But he also would elaborate his clothing. And so on the right, I think this fabric might have been from Mexico, and then he appliqued on top of it. So this exhibition I was invited to participate in, I wanted to make a quilt specifically for it. And so this was the quilt I made, and it's the first time that I've incorporated, this is an embroidery on weaving that had been a huipil, which is like a pre-Hispanic top, but had then been recycled into a pillowcase. So I bought it in its form as a pillowcase and then brought it in. But I was interested in the circular form, and then how the sleeves were just kind of repurposed to fill that void in the circle. But anyways, I'm kind of going off on tangents, but that was for the Pasaquan show. And then since COVID, when we had the stay-at-home orders at the very beginning, I sort of knew that I needed to make a quilt. And what did I have around? Well, I had an old bed sheet, and I had some scraps, and then I had these hospital scrubs that I had collected at thrift stores because I thought the colors were really beautiful. But obviously now they had like a whole new meaning to be part of this quilt during a time when frontline workers are just like such heroes. And so that occupied me for the beginning, and I was hoping it would, sort of speed up the process, but I'm now onto some more quilts. So these were quilts that some wonderful participants made in a workshop I taught at Penland in 2019. Oops, oh, my bad. This is another quilt that's in the exhibition, and I wanted to show this for a variety of reasons, but one sort of ironic thing is that Pantone has announced that the colors for 2021 are yellow and gray. So they were my colors in 2019. But I also just kind of find it amusing how people talk about color, and like this is all the more reason why color gets sort of brushed aside as being subjective, because you can kind of make arguments in different directions. So, but the reason why I wanted to look at this quilt right now is as kind of a segue from the quilts that I've been making into the tapestries I've been working with weavers in Mexico to create. So in this exhibition at Warren Wilson, the work on the left, it's the work on paper, and the quilt are both in the show. And I'm not an artist that typically like creates a sketch and knows sort of where something's going and follow through, and that's how my process is. It's much more of an intuitive kind of improvisational process. But in this case, I was curious to see how this design might translate across different media. So on the left, it started with a gouache on paper, and you can see the sort of turquoise tapete that's installed. This was part of the installation at Philadelphia Magic Gardens, where I painted the wall as part of the installation. But I also had this design created in a couple of other color palettes to test different color combinations. And then I decided I wanted to make it into a quilt. And so then this grid sort of became situated on a ground of 2 colors, creating a slightly different spatial dynamic. But these are other ways that my tapetes have come into being. So on the left is a collage that's fabric and, again, paint skins on a mate paper, which is this like tree bark paper that they make in Mexico. And then on the right, there's a painting on paper, and then just a page from my sketchbook. So it's not like I always go to the same gridded paper to design in the same way. These are the very first rugs that we made. So just to give you some more context for this, in 2014, I spent 9 months living in Oaxaca, Mexico, as Julie said, through a Fulbright Garcia Robles grant. And the intent was to go down and study indigenous textiles and learn about the natural dye process, because Oaxaca is incredibly rich in its textile culture, but also it has cochineal, which is the little bug that lives on the nopal cactus and is it's cultivated and dried and crushed up to create an intense red dye. And so I wanted to learn more about the process of the natural dyes. And I went down there and I took some workshops at like a cochineal farm and learned about the process. But ultimately, I started making rugs without using the natural dyes. So that's, just so you know, just want to put that out there. Like, these aren't all natural dye rugs. The colors are too intense. But in doing so, when I arrived in Oaxaca, it was just like after I'd been there a couple of weeks, I saw a poster for a Zapotec language course that was to learn the variant specific to Teotitlan del Valle. And Teotitlan was a village that I knew I wanted to spend time in, because that's where these woolen flat weave rugs are made. And so I enrolled in the course and spent 3 months learning a language that I'll never be able to speak. But it was a great way to learn more about the culture of this place, and also to just engage with weavers on a more kind of intimate level. And so I would go to the Sunday market in Tlacalula, a nearby town. And one Sunday I met this couple just by like embarrassingly speaking Zapotec, and we just connected. And I wasn't even planning on making rugs at that time, but I had been making these sketches in my apartment. And one day I thought, let me just see if they would be up for making one of my designs. And so that started the process. And so, like I said, this one on the far left was the very first one I made. And you'll see there's fringe coming off where the warp threads were still exposed. And you'll see on the right the small drawings, and then I would go to their workshop and pick out the skeins of wool that I wanted to use. And sometimes they might not have the exact colors that I wanted, so it might I'd have to adapt my design to what was available. And that's something that's just continually important through my work, whether it's working with scraps of wood or whether it's making a quilt. It's just really trying to kind of adapt to the circumstances. So here, this was a later visit when I thought maybe having like traditional tapestry cartoons might help, so I made paintings that were to the scale of the rugs I wanted. It actually didn't really, they made some beautiful rugs with this process, but ultimately, we translated, the designs I make are defined by horizontals and verticals. So we can translate them into just distances, and then they are able to follow that map. So since 2014, I've gone back, at least every year except for this past year, and spent time with the family. And, this is a picture of me weaving, but they do all the weaving of the rugs. I kind of fool around, but they are like the master weavers, and I trust them with the work. So here's a little bit of a view of the process. So on the top left is a runner that they were weaving on the loom. And then on the right is Leachy using tweezers to pick out the just organic matter in the wool, because this wool, and even though they get as clean as possible before, like you have to pick out just little burrs in the wool and then take it off the loom. And then on the right is where they use an embroidery needle to sew the warp threads back in to get that clean line. This was the last visit when I went there, and I took my daughter. So you can see this was in their altar room. They had dyed a crazy amount of yarn in advance of my arrival, which was just magical to like select yarn in that space. And Iona had a good time too. But on the right are some of the bags that we've been making. So this has, been a very difficult year for them, obviously, because their economy is based off of tourism. So I've sort of created like an online marketplace for selling some of the goods we've been making. So there are bags available. And let's see. And then these are recent rugs that we made this year. 4 of these are on view in the gallery. And so in the past, I've really, to sort of spend the money and have them translate a design into a rug, I've always kind of wanted to make a new rug, a different design. But now that color has become so complicated in this distance of COVID, it seemed like a good opportunity to make variations of color. And this is something that Joseph Albers did most famously with his homage to Square, but also he had a series of variants, also known as his Adobe series. And I should have put an image of them in, but they're inspired in part by the architecture of Mexico, because Joseph and his wife Ani, who's an incredible textile artist, made many trips to Oaxaca, Mexico. So these are some of the other rugs that are in the exhibition. And these can be wall works, they can be functional rugs. Like it's like with the quilts, they can be on a bed, they can be on a wall. And I really sort of appreciate that open-endedness. So here's a view where you can see the tapetes in the background and then the Albers in the case. And then this is a lithograph that I made. And because of knowing that I would be showing the Albers plates, I decided to bring some prints into this exhibition. And I feel like printmaking and artists who work with master printers is kind of a similar parallel to like the way that I work with Leach and Augustine, where, it's not like a true collaboration where you're both sharing in the ideas and the generating of a design, but there are these sort of abilities that are joining together. This was a screen print that I made with another master printer in Durham, and it was for a hotel in Durham, the Durham Hotel. But again, like this exhibition has provided an opportunity for me to look back at different works. So I remember when I made these screen prints, I was interested in kind of trying to create a design that had a very open form and almost acted like an object on the page. You can see how the white of the paper is part of the design. And so it's almost like you're looking through something. And that was working with ceramics at the Kohler Arts Industry Program. So this is a tinted slip-on. I just got a thing that says my internet connection is unstable. That's not good. So can you hear me? Everything's okay? Okay.
It was a little broken up, but we could still understand you. It seems okay now.
Okay, great. Thanks. So yeah, in 2018, I was a resident of the Kohler Arts Industry Program, and you might recognize the name Kohler because they make a lot of sinks and toilets. And they have this really exceptional program where they invite artists in to work in the factory. And there's not a whole lot of assistance other than just them showing you the basics of mold making. So early on, I made these little dishes, and then the more I worked with the material, I realized its limitations and sort of its potential. And so I had taken a number of vessels that I wanted to cast, one of which was a wooden tray that I bought in Oaxaca. So it was this hand carved wooden tray. And so I cast it and then sort of flipped it. So like what would have been the bottom of the tray became the front of the painting. So these are wall-based reliefs. And I began layering them. So I would make 2 casts of the same tray, and then it was almost like making a layer cake or something. You know, I'd like put it on top, and while the clay was still green, I would cut into it and sort of manipulate it and move parts around. And it had to be very quick. So it was like this sort of quick improvisation because the material wouldn't allow for any time. It's like I don't have much. I really don't have any ceramic background. So, but the ceramic artists I knew that had worked with like more hand building and wheel throwing described this material as being very short. And so it like you couldn't stretch it out, you couldn't roll it, it just would like crumble. And so I had to figure out how to work with it. And then also there was a limitation of color because whatever the artist made would go into the same kiln that was a football field long. It would go into the same kiln with all the toilets, or as you can see behind here, there's urinals. And so there were certain glazes that you could not put into the kiln because they might contaminate the actual objects that the company sells. So on the right, you can see the different reliefs that I made while I was in residency there. But like, if you look at that one on the bottom left, it's kind of this like silly putty color, you know, and it's like, I was trying to get as much as I could out of these, but sometimes like the color was just a little dead. And so a few of them, once I got home, I painted on top of that. And so like this one, you know, it has acrylic paint on top of the glazed porcelain. And now I'm just kind of jumping out of the gallery completely, just to show a few recent public art installations. So this was one that I did last year at the North County Regional Library in Huntersville, North Carolina. And it's using polystyrene panels, which are basically insulation foam, and painting them, installing them, and then painting the wall in between. So wanting to create this dimensional mural and having a kind of modular approach to it. And then with this one, I was sort of playing with ideas of transparency and color. And I did a similar installation a few years before at Duke University. That was the first one. And then I bring this in because this was a collage that I made a few years back, which is that amate paper I mentioned before. And then there's fabric, and the sort of grassy green is again like acrylic paint skins. And this ended up being translated into a large scale mural this past summer. So this was 5 niches at the base of an apartment complex in Raleigh, North Carolina. And I'd create all these different new designs. And then it just sort of hit me that like I wanted curves to break up the grid, and I wanted the scale to sort of occupy the space in a way that you could drive by in a car and sort of capture it, but then you could stand across the street and look and sort of compare and test the different color combinations and the symmetries and the sort of irregularity of reflection. And anyways, so that was this past summer. And then sometimes I do things in my own house. So these are the stairs that lead down to my studio. And that is where I am now. And this is an old picture of the mess in my studio, but you can see the quilt that I showed earlier. And so that is all. I wanted to leave time for questions. So please feel free to ask. And I can go back to any other slides if you need me to.
Thank you so much, Martha.
Welcome. I tend to speed through, so.
No, it was very rich, and I see a few questions here. Well, I see one question, but maybe some people can write some more. can you tell us what is paint skin?
Paint skin.
Technical question.
So if you were to take, so I started making the paint skins when I was at the Golden Arts residency. So golden acrylics you might have used before. They're really luscious, wonderful paints. And I'm not just saying that because I had a good experience there, but they really are great quality paints. They make a liquid acrylic that I was basically just pouring the bottle of paint onto a piece of like plastic sheeting and letting it dry and then peeling it off. I mean, I remember the sensation of it reminded me of fruit roll-ups. Did y'all ever have those like when you were a kid? And so anyways, it's basically just a dry layer of paint that's been removed from any substrate. So.
Great, and then you can just kind of cut it and.
Yeah.
So there's a couple of other questions here. One you answered, it says, does Martha's work, are the rugs able to be used on the floor or they adorn the walls? And yes, they do both. Do you make your quilts on a machine or do you hand quilt?
Oh, that's a very good question. I piece them together on the machine and then I hand quilt them. And I have to say, I mean, my wrist doesn't always like it, but it provides a real sense of calm for me. So it's been really helpful the last year to have hand quilting in my life.
Yeah, and then you can take it with you on the couch too.
Yeah, there's definitely that aspect. And I think having a child, I've had to shift the way I work in different ways. And at the end of the day, I'm not always wanting to come stand on the concrete floor. So I'd rather sit on the sofa and quilt.
Yeah. And then someone asked the question also, how long do these pieces take to, wait, I lost this. How long do these pieces usually take to make? And so I wonder if you could, maybe we could extend that to talking about just, that working with different materials. Do you sort of move from wood to quilt to, the ceramics you were doing elsewhere, the tapetes are done elsewhere, but are you working with things at the same time as you work and going back and forth, or?
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of back and forth. So right now I have a quilt in process, but it's something that I enter into. And then I have some paintings in process. And, I've realized that I hadn't really been making the constructions much the last few years. And that textiles have really sort of taken most of my focus. And I forgot how long it takes for me to make the paintings because they just evolve really slowly. And if I go back through photos and look at images or just snapshots of studio pics and stuff, I'll see them in their adolescence, and it's they're these characters that are sort of growing and evolving over time. And so it's not like I sort of have this idea, I put it in my sketchbook and I execute it. It tends to be a much slower process. And when you can see the paintings in person, you can oftentimes see that there are layers of color underneath where, I think, oh, let me try this purple. And then it's that's not working. I need to shift it into a navy or, I sort of let them evolve over time. And even though I kind of presented the works tonight in sort of clusters of media, there's just sort of constant cross-pollination, and I do work in a variety of methods sort of simultaneously. And I don't really work in series, so it's not like there's one idea that's sort of pursued in a single medium to completion and then on to the next thing. It's just kind of this ever evolving body.
Yeah, and I think you can get the sense of that in the dialogue or the conversations that happen in the studio between the pieces.
And I make a lot of work that I never show, or that, so there's I think a really important part of my work is actually the editing process and stripping back of things. Because my attitude tends to be well, let's just try it and see. And so there's a lot of, there's a lot of fat that gets kind of trimmed off. So.
I'm gonna go back to the chat here. So someone asked, I'd love to hear about whether the colors and geometries of the work have meaning. I think of Albers as doing color studies and being a formalist, so he wasn't ascribing meaning to his color, but maybe the Oaxacans have associated significance with their pigments and forms. And most of all, what about Martha? Is this a contribution to abstraction or to more traditional approaches to color and color form, a la Mexico, or both?
I think, well, I mean, one thing that I think there's not always a real sort of intentional sort of meaning of color kind of approach, but I think that I don't know. I feel like for me, color it's like there's me experiencing the world and looking at colors, and so being in a place like Oaxaca, you know, the light, the atmosphere, the paint on the buildings, I mean, just all of that has been sort of absorbed and it comes out. I think there are definitely cultures where color is used in very specific ways, but for me, I'm not trying to create some kind of symbology of color. It's more of, it's more of just a sort of a sensibility and a kind of exuberance that I think I'm like aiming for through color. I mean, there have been works that I've made and then I realized like, oh, that's where that's coming from, you know. So there's this subconscious effect, and I think there are times when like I'm sort of challenging myself to be like, well, what's kind of the ugliest color that I could potentially bring in and make it work, you know. So there's trying to kind of maybe I don't know, like just take colors that some people might be averse to and make them beautiful. You know what I mean? Yeah. Does that answer?
Well, one question that came up for me from that is just this idea of, you know, what you were talking about of working with the weavers and that sort of coming together of, you know, your design and intentions and their expertise and, you know, how those things sort of work with each other. I just wonder, you know, I remember this working with the Gee's Bend quilters when they went into the printmaking studio. It was like it was a lot about trying to translate that color from a fabric to, you know, the layering that had to happen on the paper.
Right.
I wonder if you have conversations with them about color and, you know, how to make the color work if you don't have exactly the right wool.
Yeah, I mean, it's been an interesting process with them because, like I said before, like a lot of my work is kind of trying to sort of work with what's at hand, and so, so when I first started working with them, I found that there were, like, I'm really interested in bringing different values into color composition. So like having light and dark colors, you know, I think a lot of times people think like, oh, Martha's work, it's very bright and colorful, but it's not all primary, neither is it all like the same level of saturation. So you'll have, you know, pale pinks or light blues that are kind of there to offset the like really highly saturated like ochres and umbers. And so one thing that has been interesting with working with Leach and Augustine is that early on, there were a lot of sort of pastel yarns that they would have around. And it was partially due to them being resourceful about their rug making. So if they were dyeing a vat of, say, blue, they would put in the yarn and make these really intensely hued blue skeins of yarn. And then the dye bath would weaken, but they would still throw in a few more skeins and it would result in like a very pale, subdued shade of blue. And so they would have these kind of paler colors in their workshop. And that was great for me to sort of offset some of the more intensely or more saturated and bright colors. And then when they started dyeing colors sort of to prepare for my arrival, which sometimes they call them colores payasos, which is like clown colors. So that's kind of how they relate to my work, is clown colors. But they I would arrive and like everything would be like so intense. And so trying to balance it out would sometimes be challenging. So I've had to kind of ask like, hey, you know, throw some yarn in some weak dye baths, you know, like I need, like, that variety is important. And but there hasn't been so much like a, hey, can you match this color? And the thing is like Teotihuacan is this village that it's just full of families of weavers, and there are some families that all they do is create tapestries that are translated from artists. And I mean, they're these incredible works, and they match them up practically to like Pantone colors, you know? So it's not like that's not possible, but that's just not really how I work. And I think I'm just much more interested in kind of the more adaptive process and the sort of surprises that result. Like there have been rugs that I've made when I've gone down there where, you know, they'll need about 3 skeins of a gold color for a rug, and they don't have 3 of the same colors. So then it's like, well, what happens to the design when all the gold is actually 3 different shades of yellow or gold? And it can enhance the design in my mind. So I feel like it's like Bob Ross happy accidents or something.
So I'm going to do a couple more questions here. There's a grouping of questions around your quilt making process, of whether you're using found fabrics, experimental materials, store-bought fabrics. Do you dye the fabrics, or do you just, you know, get the colors that you want?
Mm-hmm.
Are you always on the hunt for fabrics?
I am always on the hunt for fabric. And most of the fabrics are sort of reclaimed fabrics. I'm really lucky that in Durham, there's this place called the Scrap Exchange. So I can buy fabric, but it's actually sort of donated reuse fabric. So I keep my eyes open, you know, and I buy a lot of things like curtains and bed sheets, and, you know, shop in the XXL section of thrift stores to get the most bang for my buck. But I'm, you know, I was realizing too, like when I was little, my mother loved to take me to upholstery fabric stores. And so like I've always had this engagement with like fabric and tech and like the textures and the colors. And so I always love to walk through these sort of like hallways of bolts of fabric, and or go, like I'd ride my bike to the fabric store closest to our house when I was growing up. And so I don't dye any of my own fabric. It is like ready-made colors, but the majority is found. I will occasionally buy some Kona cotton because they have good colors and it's easy to hand quilt. And sometimes I just need a certain color to balance out all the found colors.
Yeah. Okay, I think we're going to do, it's 6:55. We're going to do 2 more questions. One is, what was this? Because do you see yourself as a process-driven artist, or does your choice of process come from a different starting point? I'm not sure. How do you, that was someone from London who had to leave because it was getting quite late.
No, I mean, process is like, you know, to think about in Albert's terms, or in like Black Mountain College terms, because I realized we didn't really talk much about that. There's definitely like a learning through doing. And so I think for me, it is about process and about the activity. So whether that's, you know, bringing fabric together or drawing or, you know, cutting up paper, paint skins, it very much is about the activity. And like, I didn't talk a whole lot about the constructions, but, you know, again, that's like the quilts, where it's like this acquiring and constant sort of searching and keeping my eyes open for scraps. And then there's this process of trying to create order out of the sort of chaos of it all. And so that tends to be like a rather process driven physical activity of arranging, rearranging. So yeah, I mean, I think, but I don't know, I guess you could look at process in a variety of ways.
Well, just to wrap up, someone had asked where one can get the bags to support those makers. And that would be
I
something that,
promise I did not plant that
yeah,
question.
yeah.
Um,
But it's nice to know to support them.
it's very nice. They're on my website. There's a shop so marthaclippinger.com, and there's shop and make clutches and handbags. So yeah, and there are the rugs. So
Yes, and they're the rugs. And someone asked if you've ever thought about designing clothes with your sense of color and design.
I mean, that's what, when I was like in middle school, I wanted to be a fashion designer. And I do sew occasionally and make things. So yeah, I've made clothes in the past, but we'll see. Maybe I'll pull a Sonia Delaney. I mean, the thing that's interesting about Sonia Delaney is that, you know, she came from like a very sort of affluent, I think Russian Jewish family, and then immigrated and really kind of had to make a living for herself, and so design fabrics and created clothes. You know, she was a fashion designer, so that was kind of her way of living. So it'd be nice, but yeah.
Well, this was so great. Thank you. And I just want to say one more time that the gallery is open Monday to Friday from 10 to 4 and on Saturdays from 1 to 4. But if you email art department at warren-wilson.edu or go on our elizabethholdengallery.com, you can find out more information.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.